That's when you hear something that you've heard before. And I get that very strongly sometimes. And every time I've had it, I've been able to do a bit of research and then kind of go, oh, it's because this song is sampling some other song that I recognize. Like, there's always some reason for it. So, I don't know. I'd be inclined to.
I mean, I can understand why people think that it's just my subconscious bringing it out for no particular reason, because the reason it's been out of my subconscious could be, I don't know, some sort of survival mechanism, because I'm an average nobody and I've created this narrative to make myself seem more special. But, once again, I think I was fine with not knowing, because I knew I'd be subject to ridicule from people. I knew that some people would suspect I had dubious intentions and just setting up this podcast to, as a stepping stone for personal gain, because there's a spirituality market. So, I do need rationality and sensible dialogue about the experience, because I just think it's strange that if it was subconsciously intentional or not, I couldn't have picked a weirder belief system, because it's about our God being evil and living in a counterfeit world, which is basically simulation theory in ancient texts.
Simulation theory is very very hot right now, isn't it? Thanks to Elon Musk.
I mean, a lot of people are questioning what reality is. You've got people starting to argue whether the Earth is flat or not again. Something you think we would have solved years ago.
It's a myth that people used to think the world was flat. Everyone used to be pretty happy with the idea that it was round, and it's more of a modern internet era thing that the idea that it's flat started to actually become a legitimate belief. Although I think even that largely started as a satire that got out of hand.
I definitely see a rise in weirder fringe theories of reality bleeding into the mainstream more and more. People are having these conversations and coming up with theories on the nature of reality. And to sort of tie this back to the Rapture, I do think a lot of religions originated through direct experience, and I think there is a link between them and psychedelics. And I know they're starting to map these realms out more, because it's near enough mainstream now to talk about these things on podcasts such as Joe Rogan's Experience. He talks about DMT and machine L's, and I mean, what do you think that is, though? Do you think that it's just the brain, or it's consciousness is like a signal that the brain can tune into, and there's different levels of reality that we can experience?
I think Alan and I are both pretty much on the same wavelength, and that we're both very, very much skeptics with anything like this. But I mean, I will say, I'm very open to the idea that we live in a simulation. Just I'm not. I don't believe it to be the case, but I'm happy to accept that it's mathematically likely. When you start playing games with statistics, it's like far more likely that we are in a simulation.
So who do you think's running the simulation then? Wouldn't that be God?
It says white guys out of Prometheus. Well, no, I mean, this is it. I mean, it depends what you define God to be. I've had this discussion with many people where you'll be talking about whether there is or isn't a God, and they'll get to a point where they're like, yeah, man, but maybe God is just that feeling of like
your moral compass.
Yeah, and it's like, well, hang on, if we're completely redefining what God is to the point that it's just that, then yeah, of course God exists. Like, that's like, if we're saying like, yeah, but maybe God is just like the universe.
This is why I'm mentioning the machine L's that people see on DMT or magic mushrooms, because, if they take high enough doses, they seem to break through to, completely different realms and speak to these entities. And, I have to take into account from a materialistic and rational point of view that they could just be talking to the parts of their own brain or conversing with their own psyche, but just to entertain the idea that this is a simulation that has been created by higher intelligences, call it God or aliens, that in theory would be what we would call the divine.
I'm not even certain that it necessarily would have to be a higher intelligence in any real sense. I don't think we're a million years away from being able to replicate reality to the degree that it's indistinguishable from reality ourselves. I would give, I reckon, 20, 30 years, so long as we don't implode society on itself. I think as long as technology advances at the rate that it has, we're probably nearly at that point ourselves. And, the big thing that I always think is a very compelling bit of evidence for this is that, there are these, bits of fundamental makeup of the universe. I don't know if they're particles or if they're technically defined as something else, but essentially we can only go so small. It's like there's a limit on the resolution of the universe. Like you can only go down to so many pixels. And with science as we understand it, there should be no limit on how small the detail can get, but there is a limit, and there's the only real theory we have for that I'm aware of is, well, maybe this isn't reality, maybe it's some sort of simulation, and therefore there's a roof, a ceiling on the amount of detail that's been put into it. That's why it isn't infinite.
So,
and I think that's compelling. And the other one is, there's another reason. What is it? Oh, sorry, ignore me.
I think The Rapture is an interesting film to choose because it brings up interesting questions in regards to how spirituality or religions originate in the first place, because I think there is a strong link to actual experience and, these religions starting. It's just a shame that the Rapture doesn't do anything that visually interesting with it, because, when she has her experience, unlike the film Frailty with Bill Paxton, she just starts believing. But in the film Frailty with Bill Paxton, he has a proper, profound visual experience that makes it convincing that, you're on his side the moment you see that scene. Because it has to be a profound visual experience for people to start believing this stuff. And where you've got psychedelics now going to start being legalized or already legalized in certain parts of America, I bet you will start to see more religious fanatics and new cults being created. Not to demonize psychedelics, but, because a lot of good will come from it. But I do think psychedelics and spirituality do go hand in hand.
You don't even need psychedelics. A lot of visions of schizophrenia, epilepsy even, it can be a whole host of things that we understand in a much better way now. But it changes your perception of reality. And that's what you're doing. You're changing your perception of reality. You're not seeing something new. It's just, my kind of issue with all this religion, I guess, falls under this, but all this kind of like, oh, well, what if it's this? What if it's this? What if it's this? It's just total speculation. You need to be able to come up and go, okay, this fits the evidence. How can I then test it? You need to have a provable theory before you can even take any further steps. Otherwise, you can just make up anything you want and go, well, I believe it. So fuck you.
The other bit of information I couldn't remember, the bit of evidence I couldn't remember, I've just remembered, and it's that there's evidence now to suggest that we are, in fact, at the center of the universe, which obviously was largely thought to be disproven, but now there's people, basically, if you look at the way the universe is expanding and measure it, it seems to be expanding in such a way that would suggest that Earth is the pinpoint, like the center of it all, that it's moving away from. And to be honest, I think it's far more likely that our way of measuring that is wrong, and it's something to do with where we're measuring it from. But again, I think that's a very compelling bit of evidence. But I'm largely with Alan that, to me, bits of evidence like that come up and go, oh, interesting, but it's not enough to make me...
I mean, what I experienced is all anecdotal, but, the Gnostics preached, having direct experience rather than following gurus or churches.
I will say, to bring it back to the film somewhat, the notion that that we are created by another being and by definition, that being or those beings would then be God. I'm completely open to that. I think that's very possible. It's not something I really factor into my day-to-day life, because it doesn't really make any difference, because I don't for a second think that it's possible or believe that if that were the case, that God would be omnipotent or all-knowing. Or I think the Peter principle comes into play, and you rise to a point very quickly that you're becoming competent. And I think if we have a God, a creator, they are most likely completely incompetent. They were able to create a universe, and it works.
Spark life.
But there's problems with it, and it's ultimately no different to me putting some sea monkeys in a tank or playing Sim City, or it's that, and that's largely, I think, kind of what this film was getting at, is that if God is real, who says we have to kowtow to God? Do you know what I mean?
That's very Gnostic what you're saying. I'm not sure where I've heard this, but apparently the Gnostics used to do really weird stuff when they would have sex. Like they wouldn't come during the actual intercourse. Instead, they would do it into their hands and then raise it up to the sky to show God or the demiurge that they weren't going to drop the light into the universe, which is a bit weird and creepy. It's anti-natalist.
That's just good birth control. That's gone from being a religious sect to just standard procedure.
Yeah, Terence McKenna called them pioneers and blowjobs.
on our podcast, Diminishing Returns, I will frequently
masturbate,
improvise, that too. Oh yeah, no, I'm always masturbating. But I mean, going back to our little. Our love of doing very weak comedy improv as various comedy characters. I love improvising as Werner Herzog, and I do remember in one episode when I just kind of was, dare I say, in character, and the phrase, God is asleep at the wheel kind of just came out of my mouth. And I've ever since I said that as Werner Herzog, it stuck with me, because it's like, oh yeah, I think again, if I were to believe in God, I think, it's probably someone who kind of set life in motion and just kind of, they're not sat running things day to day, there's no way. It's just, again, the Prometheus, it's that idea that maybe life was kickstarted somewhere and forgotten about, or something happened to the creator. But then, as I say, it's not going to impact my day to day, because there's no difference to day-to-day life if life was kick-started by another.
We'd have to ask if there is a metaphysical element in the creation or not, because if it is a higher being, then that wouldn't make them God in the sense of an all-knowing, all-seeing God. It would just be like us making a genetically spliced creature and then calling ourselves God. What I wanted to do is just make a clear distinction from the people who like the idea of having a God and taking a religious path, and the people who have had full-blown mystical experiences and decided to follow a spiritual path. And I think, once again, this film could have done with a more impactful scene to articulate that.
Rodgers' character is presented in this film. I think it's clear as day she's got mental illness. I think she seems to be suffering from depression, I think, as it's presented in this film.
No, she definitely has. And okay, yeah, you've had this profound mystical experience, but that doesn't mean that you should throw rationality out the window.
Yeah, and you can argue she's showing signs of various other things, bipolar and
child neglect.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, arguably, what's it called? Not narcissistic personality disorder. I don't know if that's. I think that's probably not intentional, to be honest. But no, I do think she certainly seems to be suffering from depression. Now, I don't know if that's intentional on the part of filmmakers. I don't think depression was really a hot topic back in the 90s the way it is now. I don't think it was really as understood as much as it is now. But it seems to be a clear stand-in for the emptiness of her life, the fact that she's, trying to fill it with drugs and medicate in that way. But yeah, so she turns to religion because she falls in with a crowd of religious people.